The ruins of Stonebridge and Marrowport lay broken under smoke. Ash drifted through the valley like snow that burned instead of cooled. Inigo crouched behind the tilted husk of the jail TV, blood streaking his temple. The M4 was hot in his grip, last magazine riding light. Lyra balanced on the shattered arch of a collapsed granary, her bowstring drawn, one arrow glowing faint under her touch. Across the ruins, the Lord of Destruction loomed. His armor split with glowing cracks, molten seams hissing with every breath. His warhammer burned bright enough to cast long shadows across the broken docks. He was waiting for them to break. Inigo fired first. Short bursts, 3 rounds at a time, hammering into the same weak seam at the Lord's hip. Sparks burst, fragments of molten plate hissing into the stone. Lyra loosed alongside him. Her arrow struck true, glowing deeper as her skill thrummed through it, the shaft driving between the plates at the shoulder. The impact staggered him half a step. The giant's molten eyes turned toward them. He lifted the warhammer and swung. The air itself split. A visible ring of compressed force screamed outward, hurling dust and stone. Inigo dove behind the jail TV's wreck, the shockwave rattling its battered frame. Lyra vaulted sideways, her boots finding fractured wall as she rolled to her feet, already knocking another arrow. The Lord's voice rolled over them, steady as a tolling bell. Delay. That is all you are. Yeah. Inigo muttered, teeth gritted as he swapped mags. Let's see how long delay lasts. He sprinted, boots hammering across the cobbles, rifle barking. Brass clattered at his heels. The Lord turned, warhammer sweeping in an arc. Inigo ducked under it, the weapon's head missing him by less than a handspan. The swing sheared through the remnants of a stone wall, scattering rubble like shrapnel. Lyra's arrow sang. It buried deep in the back of the Lord's knee joint. The brute lurched, one leg dipping. Inigo seized the opening. He swung the RPG tube up from the rubble where it had fallen, sighted fast and fired. The rocket screamed, slamming into the Lord's torso. The explosion ripped armor plates loose, flames spilling from the cracks. Smoke churned. Inigo lowered the launcher and spat grit. That did something. From the fire, the Lord stepped forward, molten blood hissing against stone. He had not slowed. Not enough, Lyra said grimly, loosing another arrow that glanced from his helm. The Lord roared, not with rage but with force. He swung the warhammer two-handed, smashing it into the earth. The ground split open. Cracks ran in glowing lines, magma bleeding upward. Stonebridge's ruins groaned as chunks collapsed into the river, steam gouting high. Inigo stumbled, caught his footing and cursed. He's trying to sink the whole valley. Then we don't give him time. Lyra's eyes blazed. She vaulted from her perch, dashing with supernatural speed. She slid low, loosed point blank, and her arrow pierced deep into the seam at his waist. The Lord's gauntlet snapped outward. He caught her mid-motion, massive fingers closing around her. Insect, he said. Lyra kicked, twisting, but his grip was crushing. Inigo sprinted, slamming the Browning's stripped receiver into place on the rubble. He yanked the feed belt taut and squeezed the spade grips. The .50 caliber roared, slugs tearing into the Lord's forearm. Armor cracked, glowing lines bursting open. Lyra wrenched free, tumbling hard onto the stone, coughing blood but alive. The Lord turned, golden eyes narrowing at the smoking machine gun. Inigo met that gaze and squeezed again. Come on, you bastard. Rounds hammered him back a step. Not defeat but pressure. Enough. The Lord swung the hammer one-handed. The shockwave slammed into the Browning, wrenching it from the rubble and sending it spinning into the ruins. Inigo was hurled back, the breath crushed from his lungs. Lyra fired into the opening, her last arrow streaking like lightning. It struck the crack in his chest, sinking to the fletching. The Lord staggered, molten blood spraying across the stones. But still he advanced. Fall, he intoned, raising the hammer high. Lyra pulled a spare arrow from the rubble, a shaft splintered but usable. Not yet. She loosed. The arrow struck his gauntlet, deflecting the swing just enough that the hammer smashed into stone instead of them. The shockwave hurled rubble into the sky. Inigo rolled to his feet, M4 in hand. Lyra, we're out of time. Her eyes narrowed. Then we make time. Relentless. The fight devolved into survival. Inigo fired until the rifle clicked dry, then slammed home his last magazine. He dashed between cover bursts sparking against armor, never enough to stop, always enough to harry. Lyra vaulted broken walls, arrows striking joints, helm and seams. Each bought heartbeats. Each kept the Lord turning. But his pace never faltered. Every hammer swing collapsed another section of ruin. Every shockwave widened the cracks. The valley itself seemed to groan under his weight. Inigo ducked behind a fallen tower, ribs aching, lungs burning. He slammed another rocket into the RPG tube with trembling hands. Lyra appeared beside him, blood on her lip, eyes hard. "We're not winning. We're not losing either," he said, hefting the launcher. She almost smiled. "Then let's keep the pressure." They surged together. Inigo's rocket slammed into the Lord's chest, ripping another plate away. Lyra's arrows followed, one burying in his thigh, the other in his side. Molten blood hissed, dripping across the stones. The Lord paused, just for a breath. His molten eyes narrowed. "Knives," he said again, but his voice carried strain this time. "Small. Delay." He raised the hammer, flame coiling around it. The heat seared the air, blistered stone, turned the ruins into a furnace. Lyra drew another arrow, breath steady. Inigo braced the M4, the barrel glowing hot. The three of them stood locked, ash swirling, ruin groaning. No retreat, no surrender, no end in sight. The battle raged on, neither side yielding. The ruins shook with every step the Lord took, each impact cracking the stone further as if the earth itself wanted to get out of his way. Ash swirled thick, coating Lyra's lips and teeth, tasting like iron and smoke. Inigo shouldered the M4 again, barrel nearly warped from the heat of sustained fire. He shifted his stance, weight low, trying to keep every shot precise. 3-round bursts spat fire, ricocheting off molten seams. He was burning through his last rounds, but each trigger squeeze kept the giant's gaze split between him and Lyra. Lyra vaulted up a fractured wall, balancing like a dancer on uneven stone. Her bowstring thrummed, the arrow glowing faint blue as her skill amplified the shot. She exhaled, then loosed. The shaft sliced the air and embedded itself in the seam along the brute's collar. The impact rang sharp, forcing his head to twist slightly. The Lord's molten gaze narrowed. Insects should not sting. He slammed his warhammer into the rubble at his feet. The blast rippled outward, stone chunks flying like sling bullets. Inigo ducked low, rolling behind a cracked column as shards punched into the wall with enough force to crater. Lyra slid behind her perch, dust and heat curling around her as fragments whistled past. "Too close," she hissed, stringing another shot. "Means he's noticing," Inigo barked back, slamming the M4's bolt forward. The Lord advanced, fire dripping from his hammer, sizzling on the shattered cobbles. He swung one-handed, the sheer wind of it blowing ash aside in a violent arc. Lyra dove clear, an arrow already leaving her fingers as she twisted midair. It struck his thigh joint, sparks spraying. The impact forced his knee to dip. Inigo seized the moment. He shouldered the half-broken RPG tube again, balancing its dented frame against his arm. One squeeze and the rocket screamed across the ruins, hammering the Lord in the chest. The explosion tore away another molten plate, fragments raining down in glowing chunks. The giant paused, smoke curling around him. For a heartbeat he seemed still. Then he stepped forward, molten blood seeping from his cracks, sizzling down his armor. Lyra landed hard, breath ragged. That should have slowed him more. Inigo gritted his teeth. The Lord raised his hammer high, heat swelling until the air warped. "Fall," he intoned again, voice unshaken. Inigo braced the rifle. Lyra knocked another shaft. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the broken square, facing the furnace glow of his gaze. The hammer descended. But they both moved faster than thought. Lyra vaulted left, arrow whistling past his gauntlet, forcing his aim wide. The hammer struck earth beside them, the shockwave splitting stone and tossing rubble sky-high. Inigo dove right, rifle spitting fire as he hit the ground, rounds sparking against the giant's exposed hip joint. The Lord turned, cloak of flame sweeping ash into a spiral. His armor was fractured now, cracks bleeding molten light. But his steps never faltered. Each stride chewed the ruins closer, hammer dragging furrows in the stone. Lyra spat dust, knocking another shaft with bloody fingers. "We can't keep trading like this." Inigo chambered his last rounds, breath harsh. Then we make him bleed faster. The ruins thundered around them as the Lord raised his hammer yet again. And still the fight raged. The ruins of Stonebridge and Marrowport boiled with heat and silence. Smoke curled in the air, black against the red glow bleeding from the seams in the Lord of Destruction's armor. Each breath he took made the molten cracks flare and hiss, as if the world itself was being smelted around him. Inigo braced behind the tilted husk of the JLTV, chest heaving, his last magazine running dry. Lyra crouched on the broken ribs of a granary wall, one arrow left in her quiver, its tip glowing faint with the shimmer of her skill. Both were cut, dusted with ash and running on the thin edge of exhaustion. The Lord raised his hammer high, the weight of it dragging the air into silence. His molten eyes fixed on them as though they were nothing but embers left to be stamped out. Fall, he intoned, the word carrying like a bell tolling for graves. The hammer descended. Lyra moved first, springing left in a blur, vaulting off broken stone. Her arrow streaked wide of his gauntlet, forcing the hammer just enough offline that it smashed into cobble rather than skull. The shockwave cracked the ground, stone teeth erupting skyward, tossing both fighters apart. Inigo rolled hard, ribs screaming, dust blasting across his face. He came up braced on one knee, rifle barking in short, sharp bursts. The rounds sparked along the molten seam at the Lord's waist, ricocheting sparks bright as stars. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it made him look. Lyra landed atop a broken arch, string already pulled to her cheek. Now, she called. The arrow shrieked through the haze, trailing a shimmer that made the air bend around it. It buried itself in the crack Inigo's fire had chewed open. For the first time the Lord's stride faltered. His knee dipped, weight shifting awkwardly, molten blood seeping in bright rivulets down scorched armor. Inigo's pulse jumped. He bleeds, he spat, disbelieving even as he saw it hiss against the stone. The Lord's head turned, molten eyes narrowing. His voice cracked the air. Knives. But still knives. He wrenched the arrow free with a motion that sprayed molten ichor across the ground. The cobbles hissed, tiny pits smoking where it landed. The brute lifted his hammer, slower this time, one gauntlet pressed to his hip as if unconsciously shielding it. It was progress. A wound. A mark on the invincible. Inigo snapped a half-broken RPG tube off the rubble, jammed a warped rocket into its rails and shouldered the crooked weapon. No sight, no time. He fired. The rocket screamed across the ruin, impacting square into the crack Lyra had opened. The blast tore another plate free, molten shards clattering across the stone. The Lord staggered 2 steps backward, gauntlet clawing at the exposed seam. The roar that followed was not rage but pain. Lyra's eyes widened, her breath catching. We can hurt him. Inigo slammed a fresh mag into his M4, the bolt snapping forward. Then we keep hurting him. The Lord answered not with words but with his hammer. He swung it one-handed, dragging a shockwave that cleaved stone like paper. The blast hurled rubble through the air, shattered the husk of the JLTV, and tossed Inigo clear across the square. He slammed into a cracked column, pain spiking through his ribs, ears ringing. Lyra vaulted clear, rolling hard, dust blasting across her face. She pulled herself upright, blood at her lip, bowstring already drawn. She loosed fast, arrows rattling out in a rhythm sharper than breath. Each struck sparks, one biting deep into the Lord's gauntlet seam. The brute turned toward her, cloak of flame coiling, warhammer dragging fire behind it. Insect, he rumbled, raising the hammer high. Inigo staggered upright, vision swimming. His rifle rattled, each burst hammering the seam Lyra had marked. Not an insect, he muttered through grit teeth. More like a hornet. The hammer fell. The impact split the square, rubble blasted into the sky. Lyra was hurled from her perch, landing hard, breath knocked from her lungs. Inigo ducked behind a toppled arch, ears ringing, teeth clenched. He checked the mag, half empty already. The Lord loomed through the dust, cloak of flame curling like smoke given purpose. He dragged his hammer across the stone, each scrape leaving molten trails that burned like open wounds in the earth. His gaze fixed on them both, no longer bored. He had noticed them. The fight devolved into fragments of survival. Inigo darted between cover, rifle hammering in short bursts, brass clattering at his boots. Lyra vaulted walls and collapsed beams, arrows striking joints, helm and seams. Each shot bought seconds, each burst forced the brute to turn, to adjust, to waste motion. And still he advanced. Every hammer swing broke another section of ruin. Every shockwave cracked the square wider. The city itself seemed to groan under the weight of his presence. Inigo slammed his last mag home, the bolt rattling forward. He exhaled, wiped grit from his eyes and fired again. "Come on, keep looking at me." The Lord obliged. The molten eyes fixed on him, warhammer swinging in an arc wide enough to take down half a tower. Inigo dove flat, the blast tearing cobble where he'd stood. Lyra's arrows streaked in the distraction, burying in the back of the brute's knee. He lurched, knee dipping again. "Hit!" Lyra shouted. Inigo snapped the RPG tube back up, loaded his last rocket and fired. The explosion tore molten plates free, a blast of slag raining down. The brute staggered backward, his gauntlet pressed to the new wound. Molten blood hissed down his thigh, glowing like smelted ore. The Lord roared again, louder this time, the sound shaking stone and dust from the ruined walls. His hammer rose high, flame coiling around its head, heat warping the air. "Fall," he intoned again, voice shuddering the ruins. Inigo gritted his teeth, rifle raised. Lyra strung her last arrow, the glow crawling up the shaft. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the broken square, facing the furnace of his gaze. The hammer descended. But they both moved faster than thought. Lyra vaulted left, arrow streaking bright as lightning, piercing the seam in his gauntlet and forcing the swing wide. The hammer smashed into stone, shockwave hurling rubble skyward. Inigo dove right, rifle rattling, bursts hammering into the wound at his waist. The brute twisted, cloak of flame sweeping ash into a spiral. His armor cracked further, glowing seams spreading like fractures in glass. He staggered just slightly, but he staggered. Lyra landed hard, stringing the last arrow. "He's weakening." Inigo chambered his final rounds. "Not fast enough." The Lord's molten eyes flared brighter. He roared, hammer raced again, voice a prophecy. "When I finish here, Aldrich will be ash." Inigo spat blood, rifle braced. "Not if we burn you first." Lyra loosed. The arrow streaked, glowing bright enough to sear the air. It buried itself deep in the wound at his waist, vanishing to the fletching. The brute lurched, molten ichor spilling across the cobbles in hissing rivers. Inigo surged forward, rifle hammering point blank into the wound. Sparks sprayed, molten blood splattering his vest. He kept firing, teeth bared. "Bleed, damn you." The Lord staggered, knees dipping, hammer dragging as he caught his balance. He snarled, molten cracks splitting wider. For the first time since he had risen from the obsidian ring, he looked less like inevitability, and more like something that could be killed. The fight raged on, the ruins themselves groaning under every blow. The Lord's hammer cracked towers into rubble, shockwaves shattering cobbles into dust. Inigo and Lyra darted between cover, weapons rattling, arrows hissing. Every shot, every strike, every breath became a bargain with time. But the wound was real. The ichor hissed against stone. His steps were slower, his swings heavier. He was still a furnace, still destruction incarnate, but he was not untouchable. The stalemate held. Progress had been made. But it cost them. Inigo's arms shook with the recoil of every burst. His vest was scorched where molten blood had spattered, the stink of burning leather clinging to him. Lyra's quiver hung empty, the string of her bow fraying from strain, her fingers raw. They were alive only because they moved faster than fear, sharper than exhaustion. The Lord of Destruction stood taller still, his hammer glowing with furnace heat, cloak of fire licking higher in the night. But his armor bore the truth they had carved into him. Cracks running deep, ichor dripping in molten streaks, seams split wider with every clash. He was wounded. He could bleed. And he knew it. His molten eyes narrowed, gaze burning into them with something colder than rage. Calculation. Recognition. "Insects that sting," he rumbled, voice like collapsing stone. "Then I will remember your names when Eldrith burns." He stepped forward, hammer dragging a fiery trench through the cobbles. Inigo and Lyra braced, shoulders squared, no more arrows to waste, no more rockets to fire, only grit left in their veins. The ruin groaned around them, smoke rolling thick. The fight was far from finished. But for the first time it was not hopeless. Heat bent the air into a wavering sheet, Ash riding it like snow that had forgotten how to cool. The Lord of Destruction stood 30 paces out, cloak of flame drawn tight, hammerhead low enough to score the cobbles with a glowing groove. His armor was cracked now, real cracks, not cosmetic. Molten seams hissing where Lyra's shots and Inigo's rockets had bitten. He was still inevitability given shape, but inevitability bled. Inigo thumbed a fresh magazine from his vest and dragged 2 quick sigils along the brass with a dirty fingernail. Simple augmentation marks, the kind he could etch by touch and push power into without a chant. Conventional brass, jacketed lead core, standard propellant. Nothing exotic. The magic didn't conjure new physics. It shoved the existing ones harder. Straighter flight, tighter grouping, a moment of extra drive across armor seams. He seated the mag, racked the M4 and felt the faint hum in the receiver like a live wire. Left, he said. Lyra's chin dipped, eyes never leaving the brute. She had 6 good shafts in her quiver and 1 oddball she'd kept for a bad day. A bodkin head scavenged from a ruined armory, heavier than her normal cut. He palmed it to the front. They moved together. Inigo cut a diagonal to split the Lord's focus. The M4 chattered in 3-round bursts, the augmented rounds stinging with a hard, clean ring when they struck plate. He walked his fire along the exposed hip seam they'd opened earlier. Sparks spat. Molten light leaked and sealed. Lyra vaulted a low wall, landed on a broken lintel and loosed. The first arrow kissed the collar seam and skipped. The second bit deep in the thigh joint. She felt it land like a cord thrumming through her fingers and moved again before the return swing came. The Lord's head turned, molten gaze cool as a surveyor's. He rolled his hammer wrist and sent a pressure ring out with no effort at all. The air itself caved and snapped back. Inigo flattened behind a tooth of stone, shock hitting like a shove from a truck, then came up already firing. The enchantment buoyed his stance, bled off a slice of recoil, made the muzzle settle faster. The rifle sounded like a metronome against the ruin. Belt, he barked, pointing with the barrel toward the toppled jail TV and the Browning they'd ripped free earlier. Lyra was already moving. She slid down a slope of half-melted brick, skidded to the ripped .50 where it lay on its side in dust and heaved. The receiver and barrel were intact. The cradle was bent. Good enough. She braced her boots against the stone, dragged the chunk of gun into the crook of a knocked-down pillar, and snapped an ammo can open with the heel of her palm. Inigo drew a quick line of power along the links as he reached her. Enchanting individual .50s was a fool's game. The belt got the push as a whole. Drive, coherence, a thin, stubborn insistence to punch where directed. He shoved the feed into the tray, slammed the cover and dragged the spade grips up, shoulders low behind the warped shield. The Browning roared. Augmented .50 slugs hammered the Lord's chest like a carpenter with a grudge. The impacts chipped burned plate then chewed. The giant rocked a fraction. Not panic, pressure. Lyra's next arrow flashed under the pounding and buried itself in the narrow window the heavy had opened. Molten ichor hissed, spattering the stone. He answered. The hammer swept in a low lateral arc, not a showy blow, just precise. The pressure ring tore the Browning off its improvised perch and flung it back like an insult. Inigo rolled with it, letting it take him, coming up with the M4 already tracking. Lyra hit and slid, caught her breath on torn palms, then hopped to her feet with a grimace and kept moving. You didn't stop. Stopping made the next hit bigger. Inigo, she snapped. Hip seam. Working it. He hammered the ragged edge where the rocket had blown the plate free. The enchanted 5.56 cracked with a bright glassy note as they dove into that wound. 3 rounds punched through, then 3 more stitched in. The Lord's step changed. A knee dipped, a tiny catch he couldn't hide. RPG. Inigo called. Lyra sprinted, skidding under a fallen beam to where the tube lay. She dragged the heat round from its sleeve, popped the cover and slapped the fin cage open. Inigo slapped his palm across the warhead and shoved a thin wash of power in, not to make it magical but to steady the jet, harden the cone for the first millisecond of collapse. He shouldered the tube, exhaled and fired. The rocket streaked, smoke slicing the fog of ash, and hit low on the chest. The shaped jet cut through burned steel then bit meat. The detonation kicked him back a step. The Lord's torso twisted, a snarl of molten light ripping across the breakwater as a plate tore loose with a sound like a bell being murdered. Lyra's next arrow flew the instant the smoke cleared. It drove into the new gap and vanished to the fletching. The Lord's breath came out wrong, more a hiss than a word. Not invincible, Inigo said. The Lord raised his hammer again and pressed it into the ground like a farmer testing soil. The cobbles around his boots cracked, lines racing in clean geometry out under the square. Everything along those lines forgot what it had been attached to. A tower scrap toppled and burst into chips. The ground beneath the ruined JEL TV sagged and settled, rattling the microframe that held a certain case shut. Inigo's eyes cut that way. The case was a squat, dull green thing with a hand slot and a little grin of cooling vents. He had bolted it into the JL TV's rear during a week when optimism outweighed sense. Lyra, he said, we're going to need stupid. We're already doing stupid. Stupider. They pivoted under another shockwave, skirting the new fault lines like dancers who'd rehearsed for a stage that kept moving. Inigo slid to the JL TV, kicked the bent hatch twice, then ripped it open with an augmented yank that made something in his shoulder pop. The case clunked free. He popped the latches and lifted the XM214 microgun out by its carry handle. It wasn't the romantic minigun from Holovids. It was shorter, meaner. A 6-barrel 5.56mm Gatling with a compact battery pack slung on a harness and a drum that latched to the left side. He snapped a drum in, slung the pack and pressed 2 fingers to the polymer, pushing a shallow enchantment into the feed and the motor both. Smoother cycle, steadier spin, less scatter in the first second before the barrels bit. It was still a conventional gun. It would just act like its tolerances had a better day. Lyra gave him a look that was half you're insane and half good. I'll keep his eyes, she said. Inigo thumbed the safety off, braced his feet and spun the barrels up. The microgun sang. It wasn't thunder, it was ripping silk. A white hose of tracers lashed across the Lord's torso, then his shoulder, then slid to the hip seam as Inigo rode the recoil with a grounded, rolling stance. The augmented stream walked tight, piston steady, the motor whine rising into a clean, hungry pitch. Copper jackets splashed sparks, then dug, then stitched glowing lines where the armor had already thinned. The brute staggered a half step, cloak of fire guttering under the stream. He slammed the hammer down to make the ground buck. Inigo went with the lift, sliding, letting the barrels keep their line. Lyra loosed 2 more in that window. One into a visor seam that rang like a bell, one into the left elbow joint. The Lord shook the shaft out and swung high. The warhammer hit air. The pressure ring ripped the world. Inigo ducked and dragged the microgun with him, the barrels whining down then biting back up as he rose. He was emptying a 1,000-round drum in seconds. He knew it, didn't care. Time was a fuel too. Reload. Lyra shouted over the wineglass shriek of superheated stone. Working. He slapped the drum loose, caught it by the rim and tossed it. Lyra snatched it one-handed, slid the next in from the case and slammed it home while he kept the muzzle high to discourage pursuit. The second drum spun. The hose resumed. The Lord had had enough. He stepped through the stream with the ugly patience of a man walking through rain and swung the hammer in a short, savage arc at Lyra's perch. She sprang too late by a breath. The hammerhead clipped the edge of the stone she launched from, then the rim of the head itself took her across the side of her helm and shoulder. The sound cut the air. Not a crack. A gong. Lyra cartwheeled midair, limp on the last half of it, and hit the ground in a tumble that stole her breath and then the light. Her bow skittered away, clattering off broken tile. Lyra. The battlefield stank of burnt stone and iron. Heat shimmered off shattered walls and blackened timbers. Lyra's bow lay twisted on the cobbles, its strings snapped. She herself sprawled half on her side, her body limp, blood seeping from beneath her helm. Lyra. Inigo skidded across the broken ground, boots scraping on glassed cobbles. He dropped to his knees beside her and rolled her gently onto her back. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, her lips trembling as though words wanted to form but couldn't. Her chest rose shallowly, each breath a thin rasp. No, stay with me, he muttered, voice breaking despite the iron grip he tried to keep on it. His fingers probed along her ribs, her shoulder. The warhammer blow had crushed the lamellar plate, driven force through her entire frame. Her shoulder was broken, her skull ringing, maybe worse. She wasn't going anywhere. Her mouth moved faintly, but only a dry sound came out. Don't talk, Inigo said, shaking his head, pressing a bloody glove against her temple. Don't you dare. I've got this. A shadow fell across them. The Lord of Destruction stood 30 paces away, molten gaze fixed on the two of them like a predator amused by its prey. His warhammer dragged sparks where it scraped, cloak of fire curling higher as though feeding on his contempt. Then he laughed. It was not rage or triumph. It was mockery, raw and unhurried. The sound reverberated in the ruins like iron cauldrons being beaten hollow. So weak, the brute rumbled. Two gnats daring to bite. And look, his eyes slid to Lyra broken on the ground, a leaf snapped in the wind. Inigo's jaw clenched. His hands shook where they held Lyra still, not from fear but from fury so sharp it tasted like metal on his tongue. The bastard wasn't even pressing his attack. He was savoring it. Something inside him cracked. Fine, Inigo whispered, low enough for only the dying air around him to hear. You want to see what weak looks like when it's angry? He shoved Lyra gently against the cover of a shattered pillar, stood and called up the interface only he could see. He activated the Freedom Shop system. His eyes narrowed, cursor flicking straight into artillery. Rows of weapons scrolled past. M777 howitzers, Soviet 2S7 Pions railgun prototypes. None of them would be enough. He needed something obscene, something that would tear through the Lord's arrogance in a single stroke. Then he saw it. Black Dragon Artillery, Kinetic Railshell System. Price, 25,000 tokens. Inigo didn't hesitate. His hand clenched the confirmation rune. Purchase complete. Balance remaining, 1,693,123 tokens. The world flexed, and the air in front of him rippled. Metal screamed into being and suddenly the ground shook as the Black Dragon artillery stood there. A monster of steel, obsidian plating and a barrel long enough to shame siege cannons. Its hydraulic feet bit into the cobbles, stabilizers slamming down like claws. The weapon hummed with barely contained power, a predator waiting for prey. The Lord of Destruction tilted his head, molten eyes narrowing with something like disdain. Another toy. Do you think iron makes you strong? Inigo climbed the platform, hands slapping against familiar grips as though he'd been born for this. The targeting array flickered into life, its screen overlaying the Lord's figure with range brackets. Kinetic shell, Inigo growled, pulling from the storage bay. A black dart the size of a tree trunk locked into the breach. He pressed both palms against it and etched sigils quick and savage, feeding power into the alloy. Enchantment clung to the round like static, every rune sparking with hungry drive. Let's see if you can laugh, Inigo spat. The Black Dragon thundered. The shell screamed downrange faster than sound, a lance of kinetic fury. The Lord braced, cloak flaring, warhammer rising to meet it as though he could simply catch inevitability. The impact struck with a sound that split the valley. The warhammer blocked, partially. The kinetic round shattered against him, force transmitting anyway, slamming through his body like a freight train. For the first time the Lord staggered, not a fraction but a dozen steps back. His feet carved trenches in the cobbles before Shearwell stopped him. Then the second half of the enchantment bloomed. The round's remains detonated outward with a secondary pulse. A kinetic wash Inigo had inscribed himself. The shockwave hit the Lord's chest square. The brute was flung. He didn't just stumble, he launched. His colossal frame blasted through the air, a comet of fire and molten blood. He crashed into the far mountainside with a roar that drowned the river, stone avalanching down as if the mountain itself rebelled against hosting him. Inigo stared, chest heaving. His ears rang from the artillery's roar. That's for mocking her. But fury still roared in his veins. One shot wasn't enough. Not for what the bastard had done. He flipped the shop open again. Category: missiles. ATGMs, tactical ARS, precision guided. His eyes locked on the familiar silhouette. M142 HIMARS. Guided rocket system, full pod. Price: 50,000 tokens. He hit purchase. The ground shook again as a full HIMARS launcher materialized beside the artillery, its pod armed and glowing with the faint shimmer of guided runes. Inigo climbed, keyed the fire sequence, and marked the still smoking crater where the Lord had slammed into stone. Rain, he growled. All of it. The pod's lid snapped open. 6 rockets shrieked skyward, trails of fire carving into the ash-dark sky. They curved as if alive, guidance enchantments latching onto the target. A heartbeat later, the mountainside exploded. The earth convulsed under the barrage. Fire gouged in pillars. Rock disintegrated under precise, relentless impacts. The Lord of Destruction's roar cut through the barrage, furious and strained, drowned an instant later under a second wave of detonations. The ground rumbled like the end of days. Entire shelves of stone peeled away, collapsing into the valley in titanic slides. Flames licked the sky. Inigo's teeth bared. "How's that for weak?" He didn't stop. His hand slid back to the Black Dragon's breech. "Freedom Shop, ammunition. Black Dragon HE shell, high explosive, price 10,000 tokens per shell." He bought one without blinking. Tokens burned away, the shell shimmered into his hands. This one was different, etched already with charge runes, the casing bulging with packed death. He added his own enchantment, pressing kinetic stability into the warhead, steadying the detonation to release at the perfect millisecond. The shell locked into the barrel with a deep, final clang. Inigo set his sights again. Smoke poured from the mountainside, fire still raining rock and ash. And there, dragging himself out of the inferno, was the Lord, battered, cloak guttering, molten blood hissing in rivers down his frame. His hammer still burned, but his steps were slower, weight dragging. Inigo exhaled. "Say hello to high explosive." The Black Dragon fired again. The shell streaked across the valley like the finger of a god. It struck dead center where the Lord staggered out of the rubble. The explosion made the world blink. Light and fire swallowed the mountainside. The detonation blew stone apart in a kilometer-wide blossom. Shockwaves punched the valley flat. A wall of fire rolled outward, searing the river, igniting timbers that hadn't yet burned. The blast's echo rolled on as if Eldrith itself had groaned. When it cleared, half the mountainside was gone. The Lord of Destruction was nowhere in sight. Inigo slumped against the Black Dragon's plating, chest heaving, lungs tasting of ash and cordite. His vision swam, adrenaline burning itself out. The Freedom Shop interface hovered faintly at the edge of his mind, numbers tallying down to a balance that still seemed unreal. 1,683,123 tokens left. Plenty. But not endless. He staggered down to Lyra, dropped to his knees beside her again. She was still breathing, faint but steady, her face slack in unconsciousness. He brushed ash from her brow with shaking fingers. "We're not done," he whispered, voice hoarse. "But you'll wake up to know we made him bleed." Behind them, the artillery and HIMARS still smoked, engines cooling with a predatory hum. The mountain across the valley smoldered, fire running along fresh scars. The Lord of Destruction was not dead. Inigo knew it in his bones. Something that inexorable didn't die easy. But he was hurt, thrown back farther than he'd expected, maybe far enough for Eldrith to catch a breath. Inigo lifted Lyra carefully into his arms, his eyes burning with more than smoke. "Next time," he said to the ruined horizon. "Next time you'll remember our names." And the valley still trembled, as if the echo of the Black Dragon's wrath lingered in the bones of the world. Inigo tightened his grip around Lyra, standing beneath the smoke-dark sky. Somewhere in the distance he swore he heard the Warhammer's echo still ringing. The Lord would return. But when he did, Inigo promised himself one thing. Eldrith would be ready and they would not fight alone. Smoke lay in the valley's low places like a second river. The HIMARS pod ticked as it cooled. The Black Dragon's long barrel breathed heat in shimmering sheets. Beneath all of it, Inigo heard small things again. The drip from a shattered gutter, the hiss where river met hot stone, Lyra's breath. A thin, stubborn rasp. He slid to her, hands already moving. Pupils, uneven, reactive. Pulse, fast, thready. He eased a folded bandage beneath her broken shoulder to keep it high, cinched the sling tighter, and laid clean cloth along the cut at her temple. "Lyra," he said softly. "If you hear me, stay still. Breathe. Let me be stupid for a while." Her lips moved, a soundless refusal, then stilled. The earth answered with a new sound. Not rockfall, deeper. A pulse, slow as a forge bellows. Inigo looked up. Across the blasted slope, the mountain's wound gathered its fire inward. Heat folded like fabric. Light braided itself in narrow channels. A shape stood and walked out of the glare as if the bombardment had been a chrysalis. Armor that had been cracked now ran in fewer, thicker plates, edges beveled like tools. The bright seams no longer leaked. They carried heat on purpose, traced into sigils that meant weight and certainty. The cloak of flame hugged close, a second skin. His hammer had changed too. A twin-faced maul sharing a single burning core, fresh runes scoring the steel, pressure glyphs, denial marks, words that told forces where to go and where not to. The Lord of Destruction had learned. He planted the new hammer's haft into the broken street, tilted his helm as if listening for the valley's next idea. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. "You are wastes of minutes," he said, almost conversational. "Yet minutes teach." Inigo rose. The M4 came up in his hands by habit, settled back down when the math refused to lie. The HIMARS was reloaded once. The Black Dragon had an empty breech. His body felt like a ledger of owed debts. Reinforcements? None. Bells and Elandra were distant rumor. He called up the interface. Freedom Shop. Weapon catalog. He didn't browse. He stacked problems. Heavy weapons autocannons. B19/A.50 BMG triple barrel. Tripod. 8,000 tokens by M61 Vulcan 20 by 102 mm. Pallet turret plus power unit. 22,000 tokens by U8/A Avenger. 30 by 173 mm. Test stand plus hydraulics plus power cart. 120,000 tokens by Grenade Systems. MK19 Mod 3 40 by 53 mm HEDP. Tripod plus 400 RDS. 6,500 tokens by Mortars. M120 120 mm mortar. Baseplate/bipod plus He/Smoke, Ilum 30 RDS. 18,000 tokens by Recoilless. Carl Gustav M4 84 mm. 10 mixed RDS Heat/HEP/Smoke. 9,500 tokens by Atacms Pod HIMARS compatible. Block 1A unitary, 2 RDS. 95,000 tokens by Metal obliged. The square became a field of steel animals sprinting into existence. The Ju-19 unfolded on its tripod like a three-throated dog. The Vulcan turret thumped alive with a generator's purr. The Ju-8 arrived like a verdict, 7 fat barrels on a stand that bit hydraulic claws into stone. The MK19 grinned on a low-slung cradle. The mortar's baseplate hit granite with a happy, ground-agreeing thud. The Carl G came to hand light and honest. He cut his thumb, drew a line of blood along each feed. He refused to enchant the guns. They were faithful because they were simple. But he blessed the conversations their bullets would have with the world. On the .50 belt. Line and bite, keeled flight mean tip. On the 20 mm. Teeth and teeth again, shrapnel that found seams twice. On the 30 mm. Spine and steady, keep the slug centered when air said otherwise. On the 40 mm grenades, knock and enter. On the 120 mm he fall and finish. On the Carl G rounds, a single simple punch. All right, he told the valley. Lesson plan. The Ju-19 spun up. A ribbon of tracers stitched across the Lord's chest. The triple beat of .50 BMG loud enough to put grit back into a man's teeth. The bright skin around the giant dimmed a fraction. Grooves skittered across the fused plates. He walked through the stream, cloak cinched tight, hammer balanced at his hip, patience like a blade. Inigo stepped to the Vulcan. The M61's whine climbed into a hungry, glassy pitch. 20 mm arguments tore the air. Tracers arrived as tidy red accusations and burned out against bevels he didn't like. Even so, the Lord, not slowed, chose narrower steps. The hammer flicked. The new runes drank shocks and spit pressure sideways. He wasn't invulnerable. He was busy. Good, Inigo muttered. Juggle. He hit the Ju-8 power cart with a shove of raw intent to keep the motor from sagging, then wrapped both hands around the yoke. The Avenger punished, 30 mm rounds marching across the Lord's waist with the authority of a drumline. Plate peeled in hot petals. 2 shots punched through. 3. Molten light hissed like oil. Last a sound, not rage, pain. The Lord swung the hammer and pressed air into a wedge. The wedge lifted the 30 mm stream just enough to walk it across helm and shoulder instead of center mass. The 5th round smacked the visor and screamed away into rock. Mortar. Inigo barked to no one and everyone. He dropped a prepped he down the tube and nudged the bipod to bias right 6 meters. The shell came down like a blunt thought and banged under the Lord's leading foot. That earned a backward step. Balance, not fear. Inigo spent the heartbeat that bought. Atacms. The Hamar's lid flipped. A single long missile strode skyward, curled, and drove like certainty into the cobbles at the Lord's toes. The street refuted itself. Stone flew. A crater announced bad manners. He stepped out of the smoke an instant later, armor blackened, seams bright, hammer steady. Calm as weather that had decided not to change. Knives and storms, he said. I learn. You do not. The hammer didn't swing. It arrived. The Vulcan's turret casing peeled. The Gu-19's cradle twisted. The Gu-8's stand howled and sagged. The shock washed over Inigo like a sheet of fast water. He took it with bent knees and moved because staying was a promise to get hit worse. He yanked the Mk-19 onto its latch, bit a pin and lobbed a ladder of grenades. He pounded the cobbles in front of the Lord and then burst upward into his shins. If the armor was single piece now, the shock still traveled along bone-pretending metal. The giant blurred forward. No sprint, just less respect for distance. He ate 2 grenades along the hammer's faces. The runes buckled, then drank the blasts like salt. Carl Gustav. Inigo shouldered, slapped heat, scored a quick punch rune with his nail and fired. The jet bit where chest met arm and pulled metal inward with a wet hiss. The Lord looked down at the wound with the clinical interest of a man finding a tear in a beloved coat, then chose necessity. He raised the hammer high. Inigo bled a thumb along the next 30 Gu-8 rounds, steady, heavy, and held the trigger down. 30mm punishment met descending certainty. The runes drank, bled off, drank more. The blow fell anyway. It wasn't a ring. It was a drop, a sheet of weight that made stone sag and air obey. Inigo's joints popped like an abacus. He hit one knee, kept the muzzle up by habit and spite, and rode the quiver until sight returned in a narrowed tunnel. Lyra lay where he'd tucked her, just beyond the main fan of the shock, blessedly still. He would have crawled. He stood because crawling would make a truth he refused. The Lord stepped toward her. Inigo moved to be the obstacle he'd promised to be. The M4 came up by reflex. The burst he sent into the visor seam sparked, skated, and, one round, vanished inside the starred web the 30mm had begun. The helm tilted a hair. In another fight that would have been a flinch. Enough, the brute said and set his foot on the mortar's baseplate. Inigo grabbed the tube with both hands and rang the ankle seam with the muzzle like a gong. The sound that came out was low and wrong. The Lord's foot shifted half a hair. He set the hammer to catch balance. It skated on a glaze the black dragon's blast had laid across the street. He sank to one knee. Inigo fired the Carl G again, point blank into the earlier wound before the giant could stand. The jet dug a finger width deeper. This hiss had anger in it at last. The answer arrived as a hammerhead against the mortar tube. The steel collapsed into one sulking line. The shock ran up Inigo's arms into his shoulders and wrote its name behind his eyes. He flew backward, met a wall with his spine and discovered new honesty in his ribs. He saw Lyra, breath still moving. He got up. The Lord stood too, slower now, drawing heat inward to work on himself. Runes along the double Mal's faces flared to a relentless white. Atacms, Inigo said again, throat raw. One left. He keyed ground 0 beneath the Lord's feet. The missile leapt, rolled in air like a hawk and drove its certainty down. Runes bled off the hit, collapsing a ring of stone instead of the core. Talk, Inigo told the weapons, slamming a fresh kinetic dart into the black dragon's breech. He traced spine and finished quick as breath. He fired while the world still argued about what the last explosion meant. The dart crossed debate and made it moot. It struck the hammer at the collar between heads and haft. The double face tore free like a tooth. It spun end over end, cutting light in crooked hoops, and buried itself down the street with a vault door thud. For the first time since noon, surprise lived in the molten eyes. Then murder decided it had wasted enough minutes. The Lord pressed his hand down. The bright seams flared and held. A crack wrote itself from his feet to Inigo's boots, not opening so much as forgetting to be closed. The world tilted toward hunger. Inigo hosed the starred visor with the Gu-19. Bite bit. The web deepened. A tracer vanished inside like a swallowed curse. The fisher reached him and opened a mouth. He planted a heel on the black dragon's pad and threw himself to safe stone as the tripod slid away and disappeared with an almost embarrassed gulp. Across the wound, the Lord stood framed in heat, helm starred, side bleeding light, empty hand clenched. He took a step toward Lyra. "Hey!" Inigo shouted, voice cracking on rage and smoke. He brought the M4 up one more time because small storms keep big gods honest. He carved line bite across 6 rounds and sent them where eyes lived. 3 sparked wide. 3 went into the star snow. 1 disappeared. The giant touched his visor seam. Molten light licked his gauntlet. "You endure," he said, and in that was the worst thing, respect chosen. "Ours, little knife. You buy them." He looked past Inigo toward the city that had learned to ring its bells together. "Keep buying." He stepped back, not into an obsidian ring but into the crack as if it belonged to him. The fissure closed, not with a snap but with the busy indifference of a wound scarring too fast. Pressure eased. Heat slackened half a truth. The ruin remembered it could be quiet. Inigo stood bent over his knees, the M4 dangling from its sling. He counted until the black at the edges of his vision agreed to leave, then went to Lyra because all fights end where they began. He set one hand under her head, the other on her wrist. Pulse there. Breath steadier. He replaced the bandage at her temple, slid a rolled cloth under her shoulder again, and dragged her higher behind the black dragon's pad, building a low wall of broken stone with fussy care because care is what you do when you can't fix anything else. When the work was done, he sat against the warm armor and let his hands shake. The shop's pane hovered politely at the edge of his sight. Tokens, still a sea. But seas run out if you drink like a god. He tipped his head back and watched ash drift like black snow. "Ours," he said. "I'll keep the receipt." Somewhere far off, Elandra's horns and bells found a shared rhythm that meant hold. The river hissed where it found new stone. The valley tried on a silence and decided it fit badly. Lyra breathed. Inigo wiped grit from the M4's ejection port, reset the sling, and watched the west where mountain met sky. The Avenger's stand groaned. The Vulcan ticked. The Himar's pod, empty now, sat patient as a dog that had done exactly what it was asked. "Come back," he told the crack in the world. "We'll be here." He didn't know if Thorn had riders in the saddle. He didn't know if Elise had stopped pretending her ledger was something to hide behind. He didn't know if the other platinums would reach them in time. He knew how to ask the shop for heavier ways to say no. He knew how to scribe line and bite with a thumbnail he couldn't feel anymore. He knew how to stand between a hammer and a woman who hated quiet. The wind shifted. It smelled of salt and cinders and something older. Inigo rested the rifle across his knees and waited for the mountain to finish deciding whether it would move again. The valley had decided on a bad kind of quiet, too heavy as if the air were learning how to lie. Inigo sat with his back to the black dragon's warm flank, M4 across his knees, and listened to the math of the place. Himar's pod ticking cool, U8 hydraulics settling with long oil-thick sighs, the river's hiss where it licked fresh stone. Beneath it all, the one sound that kept his spine straight. Lyra's breath, thin and stubborn. He checked her again because checking was something hands could do while a mind counted unknowns. Pulse there. Skin, hot from the day, not the fever kind yet. The bandage at her temple had gone brown at the edge. He replaced it, slid the sling higher under her ruined shoulder, propped her with one more folded cloth so gravity wouldn't get clever. "Stay," he told her quietly, like talking to a dog that didn't understand words but liked his voice. "I've got the door." The door answered with a heartbeat. It rolled through the ground, slow as a bellows. Stone under his boot vibrated a fraction against the pad of the black dragon. The crack he'd dared to taunt earlier remembered it had opinions. It opened, not the surgical iris of obsidian the Lord had used in cities, not the ragged gash of earthquakes, but a clean vertical seam that widened like a polite mouth. Heat breathed out. Light bent along the edges and made honest lines. He came up out of it like a lesson returned rewritten. Armor that had been patchwork now read as one sentence. Fewer plates, thicker, beveled for purpose. The bright seams didn't look like leaks anymore. They were channels taking heat where he wanted it and teaching the skin to glow hard, not bright. The cloak of flame hugged him close. The hammer was gone. In its place he brought up an empty hand that wasn't empty at all. Runes lived along his palm and fingers, faint as tattoos until they decided to be work. He paused, looking over the field, over the smoking pallet turret of the Vulcan, the sagging Ju-8 stand, the tripod scars where the Ju-19 had been eaten by a mouth of stone. Then his helm turned and found Inigo. "Unbound soul," he said, tone almost pleased. "Cook of thunder. I had forgotten how iron speaks when a man makes it sing." Inigo stood because sitting felt like bad manners in church. "We can sing louder." A low sound rolled in the Lord's helm, not a laugh, not exactly. "Louder hurts. I have missed hurt." He took 3 steps forward. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. Inigo's thumb found the cut along his nail bed with ease born of repetition. He dragged it across a fresh M4 magazine, quick sigils that were more pressure than poetry. Line for flight, bite for the nose. He slammed the mag, racked the bolt, and took the kind of stance old instructors liked. Feet under him, shoulders soft, cheek weld honest. "Let's start simple," he said. The burst snapped sharp. 3 rounds sparked on the starred web his 30mm had made in the visor earlier. One found an opening and disappeared like a swallowed swear. The helm tilted a degree as if tasting it. "Better," the Lord said. "Speak again." Inigo didn't argue. He slid to the Mk-19's low cradle, bit a pin free and lobbed HEP in a flat arc that made disciples of gravity. Grenades bounded and popped along the Lord's path. The runes along his palm flared. Pressure bled sideways, harmless as wind. The next pair landed closer. One smacked his shin and wrapped it in a brief crown of ugly fire. The other punched into the seam where hip met thigh and thumped with a serious sound that made that leg decide on prudence for one step. He pressed because pressure buys seconds. "Shop," he said under his breath, and the pain came polite to the edge of his vision. Explosives defensive. M18A1 Claymore, 200 RDS steel balls RDX. 8 units plus M57/M4 firing gear. Price: 3,600 tokens by Fire Control/Sights. Thermal weapon sight clip-on. Long wave IR. Price: 1,200 tokens by Smoke/Obscurance. M18 smoke grenade green/white. Crate 24. Price: 480 tokens by. The crates thunked into being with the honesty of good wood. He grabbed 2 claymores by their canvas bags, sprinted 3 steps while the Lord tasted afterimages, and propped them at shin height among shattered bollards, front toward enemy flashing as instruction and prayer. Wire spooled back under his left hand. The M57 clacker hung in his right like a hymn book. "Talk," the helm said again, the word enthusiastic now. "Since you asked," Inigo muttered and squeezed. The 2 claymores coughed in a single sharp exhale. A storm of steel balls carved a knee-high sheet across the cobbles. The cloak skin flared tight. Most of the balls hissed to uselessness in hot air. Enough hit the beveled edges of plate and ricocheted in, lodging where armor bent. The Lord's step ate both blasts and came on. He liked it. Inigo saw it in the angle of the helm, not the arrogance of earlier, but something uglier and almost innocent. Pleasure that had been denied too long. The brute rolled his shoulder as if offering it. Runes along his palm brightened. He breathed like a smith at the anvil between hammer drops. Masochist, Inigo thought, and felt his mouth go dry. The worst kind. A strategist who enjoys losing pieces to learn the board. "Okay," he said out loud. "We'll feed you courses." He slapped the thermal onto the M4's rail, clicked the harness snug, and watched the giant swim into crisp white inside fog that had lied about what it hid. The visor glowed hot. The wound at his side ran down in a river of light. The palm sigils pulsed with each breath like a heartbeat he had moved to his hand. "Mortar smoke," Inigo told himself and dropped 2 white rounds down the tube. They bloomed obedient curtains, thick and cold, as fine as flour and kinder. He cut an alley with the clacker of his 3rd claymore, then ran the wire back and looped it around his wrist. The Lord liked not seeing as much as seeing. "Hide and sing, little knife," he called, amused. "Make me earn it." "Gladly," Inigo said. He slid behind the Ju-8's tired stand and kissed the power cart with a whisper-thin push, enough to keep the motor honest for one more burst. He thumbed the yoke, set the barrels where the thermal told him the helm would be when the smoke swirled, and squeezed. 30mm thunder punished the white wall, shells punching a clean trench through smoke to the glow beyond. The first 5 walked high, the 6th and 7th hit edges and peeled plate. The 8th, willed hard with steady, dug along the visor's cracked star and sent a bright flare inward. The Lord made a low noise. Enjoyment. There, he said. There you are. He lifted his palm and pressed. The smoke rolled away as if ashamed. The pressure found the Ju-8's mouth and shoved it sideways. Inigo let it shove. Fighting pressure burns energy you don't have. He rolled, landed on his shoulder and came up behind the low cradle of the Mk-19 again. Green smoke, he told himself, because order helps, even if color doesn't matter. 2 canisters hissed and poured a wall between Lyra and the giant. He threw a third high to distract the eye that didn't need distracting. Freedom Shop, he whispered. Bigger teeth. Direct fire guns. S60 57mm AA gun. Towed. Manual Traverse Plus he/TAP. Price, 15,000 tokens buy. It slammed down with the pride of old Soviet steel. Long barrel, spindly carriage legs, a handwheel begging for stubborn wrists. He didn't enchant the gun, he stroked the AP rounds in the tray with quick runes, line and deep, and cranked Traverse with a grunt that made his ribs object. Bite, he told it and squeezed. The 57mm bark punched honest holes through smoke and hit the Lord in the plate that guarded the rib of his left side. The first round smashed bevel and stopped. The second followed the first's hurt and went a thumb deeper. The third arrived inside the second's path and stayed, a black dot that flashed white on the thermal as it found meat. The Lord rocked a half-pace. Pleasure flared again in his voice. Teach me pain, he invited, drunk on it. It makes the world speak clearer. Inigo thought of Lyra unconscious behind the black dragon and decided this conversation did not need to continue. He planted a fourth claymore low, clacked it as the giant's foot crossed, and fired the Karl G while fragments still hung in the air. The heat stream licked into the fresh 57mm hurt and turned it into a tunnel. Molten light hissed out the back seam in a violent breath. The Lord's laugh came raw and involuntary, startling, like a man who had expected a slap and received an honest punch. He pressed his palm and the ground bucked, but not in a wave. He turned the buck into a roll, a fast tilting that tried to make Inigo and all of his guns choose a downhill.